Case 1. Casey Anthony, Orlando, 2008. Murder of 2-year-old daughter. Our first case needs little introduction. The Casey Anthony trial became one of the most watched criminal proceedings in American history, captivating the nation and generating fierce debate that continues to this day. But beyond the media circus, beyond the courtroom drama, lies the tragic story of a little girl named Kaylee Marie Anthony who never got the chance to grow up. Orlando, Florida, in the summer of 2008 was a city transformed by tragedy. On July 15th of that year, Cindy Anthony made a frantic 911 call that would launch one of the most extensive missing child investigations in Florida history. Her granddaughter, 2-year-old Kaylee Marie Anthony, had been missing for 31 days, and Casey Anthony, Kaylee's mother, had told no one. The details that emerged painted a disturbing picture. While Kaylee was supposedly missing, Casey had been photographed at nightclubs, participating in hot body contests, and getting a tattoo that read Bella Vita, Italian for beautiful life. She had lied to investigators repeatedly, claiming she had left Kaylee with a babysitter named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez at the Sawgrass Apartments. Investigators discovered that no such babysitter existed, and the apartment Casey indicated had been vacant for months. The search for Kaylee Anthony consumed Orlando. Hundreds of volunteers combed through woods, fields, and waterways. The Anthony family home on Hope Spring Drive became a media encampment, with reporters from around the world broadcasting updates 24 hours a day. George and Cindy Anthony, Kaylee's grandparents, maintained that their granddaughter was alive and would be found safely, even as evidence mounted suggesting otherwise. Casey's behavior during this period defied comprehension. She showed no signs of distress, no maternal anguish, no desperate pleas for her daughter's return. Instead, she continued partying, texting friends, and maintaining an elaborate web of lies. When confronted by her parents, she spun increasingly fantastic stories. Kaylee was with the nanny, Kaylee was at the beach, Kaylee was at a theme park. Each lie unraveled upon investigation, yet Casey showed no remorse, no concern, no hint of the panic any legitimate parent would feel. On December 11, 2008, 5 months after Kaylee was reported missing, a utility worker named Roy Kronk made a grim discovery in a wooded area less than a quarter-mile from the Anthony home. Human remains, small skeletal remains, wrapped in a blanket inside a laundry bag. Forensic analysis confirmed what many had feared. These were the remains of Kaylee Marie Anthony. The little girl's skull showed evidence of duct tape application, a detail that would become central to the prosecution's case. The medical examiner ruled the manner of passing as homicide, though the exact cause could not be determined due to the decomposition of the remains. However, the evidence suggested suffocation. The duct tape had been placed over Kaylee's nose and mouth. The trial began in May of 2011, and for 6 weeks, America watched as prosecutors presented their case against Casey Anthony. They argued that Casey had used chloroform to render Kaylee unconscious before suffocating her with duct tape, motivated by a desire to live a carefree life unencumbered by parental responsibilities. They presented computer searches from the Anthony home showing queries for chloroform, how to make chloroform, and neck breaking. They showed photos of Casey partying while Kaylee was missing. They detailed her lies, her fabrications, her complete lack of appropriate maternal response. The defense, led by attorney Jose Baez, presented a shocking alternative theory that Kaylee had accidentally drowned in the family pool on June 16, 2008, and that George Anthony had discovered the body and orchestrated a cover-up. They painted Casey as a victim of childhood trauma who had learned to lie and dissociate as survival mechanisms. They suggested that George Anthony, a former law enforcement officer, had the knowledge and means to stage the scene and dispose of Kaylee's body in a way that would confound investigators. The forensic evidence proved challenging for both sides. The prosecution's chloroform evidence came under scrutiny when defense experts challenged the testing methods and interpretation of results. The cause of passing remained officially undetermined. The timeline of events relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and witness testimonies that sometimes conflicted. On July 5, 2011, after less than 11 hours of deliberation, the jury returned verdicts that shocked the nation. Not guilty of first-degree murder, not guilty of aggravated child abuse, not guilty of aggravated manslaughter of a minor. Casey Anthony was convicted only on 4 misdemeanor counts of providing false information to law enforcement officers. With credit for time served, she was released from jail just days later. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Legal experts, commentators, and ordinary citizens expressed outrage at what many viewed as a miscarriage of justice. The phrase "top mom," coined by media outlets, became synonymous with suspected maternal evil escaping accountability. Protest groups formed, online petitions circulated, and death threats against Casey Anthony and her legal team proliferated. But beyond the verdict and the controversy lies an undeniable tragedy. Kaylee Marie Anthony's short life ended violently, and the circumstances of her passing remain officially unresolved. Whether through deliberate action or tragic accident followed by unconscionable cover-up, a little girl died and was discarded like trash in woods near her home, left to decompose while her mother danced in nightclubs and got tattoos celebrating her beautiful life. The Casey Anthony case exposed the limitations of the criminal justice system when physical evidence is compromised and direct witnesses are absent. It revealed how a charismatic defendant, skilled attorneys, and a high burden of proof can result in outcomes that defy public sentiment. Most importantly, it demonstrated that even in high-profile cases with massive resources and international attention, justice for young victims remains frustratingly elusive. Kaylee Marie Anthony would have been 18 years old today, potentially graduating high school, planning for college, dreaming about her future. Instead, her life was cut short at just 2 years old, and her story serves as the tragic opening chapter in Florida's catalog of maternal evil. Case 2. Sheila O'Leary, Cape Coral, 2019. Starvation death of 18-month-old son. From the international media frenzy of the Anthony case, we move to a tragedy that unfolded in plain sight, hidden behind the walls of a home in Cape Coral where extreme ideology trumped parental duty and medical reality. September 27, 2019. Emergency responders arrived at a residence on Elf Place in Cape Coral, a Gulf Coast city known for its extensive canal system and family-friendly atmosphere. They found 18-month-old Ezra O'Leary unresponsive, his tiny body cold, and showing no signs of life. Resuscitation attempts failed. The toddler was pronounced deceased at the scene. What investigators discovered in the subsequent hours painted a horrifying picture of prolonged neglect disguised as lifestyle choice. Ezra O'Leary had literally starved to passing, his body weighing a mere 17 pounds when he died, roughly the weight of a healthy 7-month-old baby. The medical examiner would later determine that Ezra died from complications of malnutrition, including dehydration, liver dysfunction, and swelling of the extremities. He had been systematically starved over an extended period, his body consuming itself in a desperate attempt to survive. Sheila O'Leary, Ezra's mother, and her husband Ryan Patrick O'Leary had imposed a strict raw vegan diet on their 4 children, consisting primarily of raw fruits and vegetables. However, even this limited diet was apparently insufficient. Investigators discovered that the children were being fed sporadically and inadequately. The other children in the home, aged 3, 5, and 11 at the time of Ezra's passing, were severely malnourished, with yellowed teeth indicating vitamin deficiency and growth stunting that would affect them for years to come. The home investigation revealed conditions that defied belief in 21st century America. The family had no running water at times, forcing the children to drink from a garden hose. Food supplies in the home were minimal, some mangoes, rambutans, and bananas, but no substantial nutrition and certainly nothing appropriate for an 18-month-old child requiring specific nutrients for development. The children's education had been neglected as well, with the older children showing developmental delays consistent with chronic malnutrition affecting cognitive function. Sheila O'Leary told investigators that the family followed a strict raw vegan diet, and that Ezra had been breastfed exclusively. However, medical evidence indicated that Ezra had not been receiving adequate nutrition for months, if not his entire life. A child requires specific nutrients for growth and development: proteins, fats, vitamins, and minerals that simply cannot be obtained from the limited diet the O'Leary children were provided. For an 18-month-old toddler, proper nutrition is not optional. It is essential for survival. The autopsy revealed the full extent of Ezra's suffering. His organs showed signs of chronic starvation. His growth had been severely stunted, and his body had begun breaking down its own tissues in a desperate attempt to survive. The medical examiner noted that the child's condition indicated prolonged neglect, not a sudden dietary deficiency. This was months of systematic starvation, visible to anyone who spent time with the child. During the investigation, Sheila O'Leary allegedly told detectives that she thought Ezra was teething rather than starving. This explanation strained credulity. An 18-month-old child who weighs 17 pounds is not simply teething. The physical signs of severe malnutrition are unmistakable: protruding ribs, distended abdomen, muscle wasting, lethargy, and delayed development. Multiple opportunities existed to seek medical intervention, to recognize that something was catastrophically wrong, to save Ezra's life. Sheila O'Leary ignored or dismissed every warning sign. What made this case particularly egregious was the element of choice. The O'Leary family was not impoverished or lacking access to resources. They lived in a suburban neighborhood in a city with abundant food options, medical facilities, and social services. The decision to impose a restricted diet on young children was ideological, not economic. Multiple family members, neighbors, and community contacts had opportunities to observe the children's condition, yet the abuse continued until Ezra paid the ultimate price. The 3 surviving O'Leary children were immediately removed from the home and placed in protective custody. Medical examinations revealed extensive malnutrition, requiring careful nutritional rehabilitation to avoid refeeding syndrome, a potentially fatal complication when severely malnourished individuals receive nutrition too quickly. These children would face years of medical monitoring, dental work, potential cognitive therapy, and psychological counseling to address the trauma of their early childhood. Sheila O'Leary and her husband Ryan were both arrested and charged with first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, aggravated manslaughter, child abuse, and 2 counts of child neglect. The legal proceedings revealed the full extent of their conscious decisions to impose dangerous dietary restrictions on children too young to understand or consent. In June of 2021, a Lee County jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding Sheila O'Leary guilty on all counts. The verdict reflected the overwhelming evidence that Ezra's passing was not an accident, not an unfortunate outcome of well-intentioned parenting, but the result of sustained neglect and deliberate disregard for a child's most basic needs. During the penalty phase, Sheila O'Leary's defense team presented arguments for leniency, suggesting that she was influenced by her husband and that she genuinely believed the diet was healthy. However, the prosecution countered with evidence that Sheila, as the children's mother and primary caregiver, had ultimate responsibility for their well-being. She had chosen ideology over survival, maintaining dietary restrictions even as her son wasted away before her eyes. On December 6, 2021, Circuit Judge Bruce Kyle sentenced Sheila O'Leary to life in prison without the possibility of parole for first-degree murder, plus 30 years for the other charges. In handing down the sentence, Judge Kyle noted that Ezra O'Leary suffered needlessly for months, experiencing hunger, discomfort, and pain that could have been prevented at any time simply by providing adequate nutrition. Ryan Patrick O'Leary subsequently accepted a plea agreement, pleading guilty to 2 counts of aggravated manslaughter and avoiding a first-degree murder conviction. He received a sentence of time served plus probation, a controversial outcome that many viewed as disproportionately lenient given his role in Ezra's passing. The O'Leary case serves as a stark reminder that parental rights are not absolute and that children cannot advocate for their own basic needs. When ideology, whether religious, dietary, medical, or otherwise, conflicts with a child's welfare, the child's survival must take precedence. Ezra O'Leary's passing was entirely preventable, a tragedy born of willful ignorance and criminal neglect masked as lifestyle choice. Today, the 3 surviving O'Leary children are receiving the nutrition, medical care, and stability they needed from birth. They face a long road of physical and psychological recovery, but they survived. Ezra was not so fortunate. His short life was defined by hunger, and his passing serves as a devastating example of maternal evil hidden behind the veneer of alternative parenting. Case 3. Julie Schenecker, Tampa, 2011. murder of 2 teenage children. Our next case takes us to Tampa, where a mother's deteriorating mental health, left untreated and unchecked, culminated in a double tragedy that destroyed an entire family in a single day. January 28, 2011. Police officers responding to a welfare check at an upscale home in the new Tampa suburb made a discovery that would horrify even veteran law enforcement officials. 13-year-old Bo Schenecker was found deceased in the family's SUV in the garage, shot twice in the head at close range. His 16-year-old sister, Kayla Schenecker, was discovered on her bed in her upstairs room, also shot twice in the head. Both children had been deliberately executed by their mother, Julie Schenecker. Officers found Julie Schenecker on the back porch of the home, covered in blood, with a handgun nearby. She was disoriented, covered in what appeared to be self-inflicted wounds, and made immediate admissions about taking the lives of her children. According to her statements to police, she had shot Bo first, while he was riding in the vehicle as she drove him to soccer practice. She had then returned home and waited for Kayla to finish her homework before entering her daughter's room and shooting her as well. The Schenecker family appeared to outsiders as successful and stable. Parker Schenecker, Julie's husband and the children's father, was a career military officer serving in the United States Army with multiple deployments overseas. Julie was a former linguist who had met Parker while both served in the military. They had settled in Tampa, living in an affluent neighborhood and enrolling their children in quality schools. Bo and Kayla were described by teachers and friends as bright, well-adjusted teenagers involved in sports and academics. But behind the facade of normalcy, Julie Schenecker was spiraling into severe mental illness. In the months preceding the tragic events, her behavior had become increasingly erratic and concerning. She had been hospitalized multiple times for psychiatric evaluation, diagnosed with depression and bipolar disorder, and prescribed various medications. However, compliance with treatment was inconsistent, and the full severity of her condition was apparently not communicated effectively to family members or properly monitored by mental health professionals. Parker Schenecker, who was away on military assignment in Qatar at the time of the incidents, later described returning home to receive the worst news any parent could imagine. His entire family had been destroyed in a single day, his children taken, and his wife facing murder charges. The tragedy rippled through the military community, the Tampa suburbs, and the family's extended network, leaving countless people grappling with grief and unanswered questions. The investigation revealed chilling premeditation. Julie Schenecker had purchased the gun used in the incidents 5 days earlier, specifically for the purpose of harming her children. She had test-fired it at a shooting range. She had written in her journal about her plans, describing her children in derogatory terms and expressing resentment toward them. One particularly disturbing entry stated that the children talked back and were mouthy, grievances so minor and common in parent-teen relationships that using them as justification for violence demonstrated profound distortion of reality. Mental health experts who examined Julie Schenecker for competency evaluations and trial proceedings diagnosed her with multiple serious conditions, including bipolar disorder, depression, and indications of psychotic breaks from reality. However, the legal question was not whether she was mentally ill, that was undisputed, but whether her illness prevented her from understanding the nature of her actions or distinguishing right from wrong at the time of the incidents. The trial, which began in May of 2014 after multiple delays related to competency evaluations, presented the jury with a fundamental question. Was Julie Schenecker criminally insane, or was she aware of her actions despite her mental illness? The defense argued that Julie was experiencing a psychotic break and could not form the intent necessary for first-degree murder. They presented evidence of her psychiatric history, her medication noncompliance, and the severity of her symptoms leading up to the tragic day. The prosecution countered with evidence of premeditation, the gun purchase, the planning, the journal entries, and the methodical nature of the incidents. They argued that mental illness, however severe, did not absolve Julie of responsibility for deliberately ending her children's lives. Assistant State Attorney Jay Pruner pointed to Julie's own words. She had told police that she shot the children because they were mouthy and that she was tired of it. On May 15, 2014, after deliberating for approximately 3 hours, the jury found Julie Schenecker guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The verdict indicated that the jurors believed Julie understood her actions and could distinguish right from wrong, despite her mental illness. In June of 2014, Judge Emmett Lamar Battles sentenced Julie Schenecker to 2 concurrent life sentences without the possibility of parole. However, the case did not end there. In July of 2015, the Second District Court of Appeal overturned Julie's convictions, ruling that the trial court had erred in excluding testimony from a defense psychologist who had evaluated Julie and concluded she was insane at the time of the incidents. The appellate court determined that this exclusion violated Julie's right to present a complete defense and ordered a new trial. The second trial began in April of 2016. Once again, prosecutors and defense attorneys presented their competing narratives: calculated execution versus psychotic break. This time, the defense was able to present the full scope of their mental health evidence, including the previously excluded expert testimony. The jury heard detailed accounts of Julie's psychiatric deterioration, her hospitalizations, her medication struggles, and her documented delusions. On May 16, 2016, the second jury also found Julie Schenecker guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Like the first jury, this panel determined that despite her mental illness, Julie possessed the capacity to understand her actions and their consequences. She received the same sentence: 2 concurrent life terms without possibility of parole. The Schenecker case highlights the complex intersection of mental illness, parental responsibility, and criminal justice. There is no question that Julie Schenecker was severely mentally ill, that she needed treatment, and that the mental health system failed to adequately monitor and manage her condition. However, the legal system determined that mental illness, even severe mental illness, did not eliminate her accountability for deliberately ending 2 young lives. Parker Schenecker, who testified at both trials, spoke movingly about his children, Bo's love of soccer and video games, Calix's academic achievements, and plans for college. He described a father's worst nightmare: being thousands of miles away, unable to protect his children from the person who should have loved them most. His victim impact statements emphasized that whatever Julie's mental state, Bo and Calix deserve to live, to grow up, to fulfill their potential. The broader question the Schenecker case raises is how society addresses severe mental illness before tragedy occurs. Multiple warning signs existed: hospitalizations, medication noncompliance, deteriorating behavior. Yet the children remained in the home until it was too late. The case exposed gaps in mental health treatment, inadequate communication between providers and family members, and insufficient mechanisms for protecting children when a parent's mental health poses a danger. Today, Julie Schenecker remains incarcerated in the Florida Department of Corrections, where she receives ongoing mental health treatment. Parker Schenecker has worked to honor his children's memory through advocacy for mental health awareness and military family support. But no amount of advocacy can restore what was lost: 2 promising young lives, ended by the person who brought them into the world. The Schenecker case serves as a tragic reminder that mental illness does not excuse violence, and that the most vulnerable victims are often the children who depend entirely on unstable parents for their safety and care. Bo and Calix Schenecker deserve protection, treatment for their mother's illness, and the chance to grow into the adults they would have become. Instead, they became victims of maternal evil compounded by systemic failures. Case 4. Tonya Thomas, Port St. John, 2012. The knock came at 4:50 in the morning on May 15, 2012. The neighbors in Port St. John, Florida, a quiet community near Cape Canaveral, had been awakened by gunshots, sharp cracks that shattered the pre-dawn silence. When they opened their door, they found 3 teenagers standing on their porch, bleeding. Joel Johnson, age 12, told the neighbor he had been shot. First Coast News. His sisters, Yazalyn, 13, and Pebbles, 17, stood with him, wounded and terrified. Inside the house next door, their mother, 33-year-old Tonya Thomas, had just begun a rampage that would become the worst homicides to take place in Brevard County since 1987. First Coast News, but the horror was far from over. As the neighbors tried to process what was happening, as they reached for towels to stop the bleeding, Tonya Thomas emerged from her home. She was very calm, witnesses reported, and called the children back. First Coast News. The neighbors watched in disbelief, some begging the teenagers not to go. But the children obeyed their mother's voice, that fundamental pull of parental authority, and walked back toward the house. It would be the last decision they ever made. The 911 call came moments later. More gunshots rang out. Brevard County Sheriff's deputies converged on the address on Bright Avenue, racing against time. When they arrived at approximately 5 in the morning, they found 17-year-old Pebbles Johnson lying wounded in the front yard. Deputies drove a patrol car onto the lawn in a desperate attempt to reach her, rushing her to an ambulance. But it was too late. She was pronounced dead in the ambulance. Officers spotted Tonya Thomas on the front porch, holding a gun. When she saw law enforcement, she retreated inside the house. A SWAT team was called. Then came another gunshot from inside the residence, the final act in this unthinkable tragedy. When officers entered through the back of the house, they discovered the full scope of the massacre. 15-year-old Jaxus Johnson was found dead in his bed. Investigators believe he was the first shot, killed while sleeping. 13-year-old Yazalyn Johnson and 12-year-old Joel Johnson, who had made it to the neighbors and back, were also dead. And Tonya Thomas lay deceased from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The medical examiner's report revealed that Thomas used a Taurus .38 caliber revolver to kill her children, firing 18 shots into their bodies before turning the gun on herself. First Coast News. There were 19 gunshot wounds total among the 5 bodies. According to investigators, after shooting her children the second time, Thomas had smoked a cigarette before taking her own life. The question that hung over Port St. John in the days that followed was the same question that haunts every familicide. Why? What drives a mother to systematically execute her own children? The investigation would reveal a family trapped in cycles of violence, dysfunction, and systemic failure. Around 3 in the morning, Thomas had sent a text message to a male coworker stating she wanted to be cremated with her children. First Coast News. Evidence that this was premeditated, planned in the dark hours before dawn. The recipient didn't see the message until after the murders, when it was far too late. Tonya Thomas's relationship with her children's father, Joe Johnson, had deteriorated. They were separated, and he hadn't been living in the home for months. Documents released by state officials detailed that Thomas was trapped in a cycle of domestic violence and was herself abused or neglected as a child. ABC News. The trauma of her own childhood had metastasized into her adult life. In 2000, the children had watched as their father yelled at Thomas for not making dinner, then punched and kicked her, knocking her into a wall. ABC News. The children were removed from the home for a month, but were returned despite objections from the Department of Children and Families. It was one of many warning signs that went unheeded. The relationship between Thomas and her children had become increasingly volatile, particularly with her 15-year-old son, Jaxus. In April 2012, just weeks before the murders, deputies had been called to the home 3 days in a row. On Easter Sunday, Thomas reported that Jaxus had thrown a bicycle through a window. The next day, she called to report that he had kicked and punched her when she tried to wake him for school. Find a grave. Jaxus was arrested on domestic violence charges and spent at least 2 days in juvenile detention. He had a court date scheduled for the very day his mother killed him. Yet neighbors painted conflicting pictures of the family. Some described the children as troublemakers who shot BB guns at houses and threatened to set fires. Neighbor Travis St. Peter said the police had been called to the house many times because the kids were terrorizing neighbors. Spectrum News. But at Space Coast Junior-Senior High School, where Pebbles, Jaxus, and Yazalyn attended, classmates described them very differently. Corbin Ratchford, who shared a physics class with Pebbles, remembered her fondly. She just brought the classroom to life. The teacher loved her. She made everything else better. News4JX, he said. Brandon Taylor, who knew Jaxus from team sports class, recalled him as someone who brought joy to every room. He was always one who would make you laugh no matter how they were feeling, what was going on with him. He just changed that. He always put a positive attitude to everybody in the class. News4JX. These were not one-dimensional troubled teens. They were complex young people navigating difficult circumstances, a separated family, domestic violence, teenage rebellion, and a mother who was herself struggling under the weight of past trauma and present chaos. The family's pastor, Jarvis Walsh, had seen all 5 family members just 2 days before the murders, on Sunday. He acknowledged the family had issues, typical teenage problems like being disrespectful, and getting in trouble at school. Things like that, but not anything bad. I don't know anything a kid could do to make their parents want to murder them, Spectrum News, Walsh said, struggling to reconcile what he knew of the family with the horror that had unfolded. Autopsy reports released months later added another crucial detail. Tonya Thomas had a blood alcohol level of 0.16%, 2 times the legal limit, at the time of the murders. CBS News. This was the equivalent of approximately 10 drinks for someone her size. Alcohol had not caused her to kill her children, but it had likely lowered whatever inhibitions might have prevented her from executing a plan she had already contemplated. Lieutenant Todd Goodyear of the Brevard County Sheriff's Office, who served as spokesman during the investigation, struggled to comprehend the crime even as he investigated it. I'm a father, and I've got kids. I cannot comprehend a person doing that to their child, calling them back to the slaughter. Action News Jax, he told reporters. The image of those 3 wounded teenagers standing at a neighbor's door, seeking help, only to be called back by their mother to die. It haunted everyone who learned of it. Experts who study familicide noted how unusual this case was. Women make up about 5% of mass killers, according to criminologist James Allen Fox. Bay News 9. Patricia Pearson, author of When She Was Bad, How and Why Women Get Away with Murder, emphasized that when women do commit mass killings, they typically don't use guns. If a gun was used, that's almost unheard of, Bay News 9, she said. Most cases where women kill their families involve young children. Infants and toddlers who cannot fight back, cannot flee, cannot knock on neighbors' doors for help. Thomas's victims were aged 12 to 17, old enough to understand what was happening, old enough to try to escape, old enough to have their own lives, friends, dreams. That made this crime even more extraordinary in its brutality. In the days following the murders, makeshift memorials appeared outside the home on Bright Avenue. Teddy bears, flowers, candles, and notes were left by classmates and community members. Space Coast Junior-Senior High School brought in counselors. Students walked through hallways in shock, seeing empty desks where Pebbles, Jax's, and Yazlin should have been sitting. The school principal announced the tragedy over the loudspeaker during lunch, and students sat in stunned silence. Teresa Daly, a relative of the children's father, visited the memorial and struggled to understand. She had a good job, you know, and she was doing good. What could make her click like this to just do this? All of a sudden, I don't understand it, Action News Jax, Daly said, voicing the question on everyone's mind. Joe Johnson, the children's father, was described as distraught when notified of his children's deaths. He had been living separately in Titusville, attempting to maintain contact with his children while navigating his fractured relationship with Thomas. Whatever hopes he had for reconciliation, for co-parenting, for watching his children grow up, all of it was destroyed in those minutes of May 15th. The Department of Children and Families came under scrutiny. Just weeks before the murders, DCF had visited the home following reports of inadequate supervision after Jax's was released from juvenile detention without being picked up. The matter was reportedly resolved during the investigation. A supervisor had signed off on the case on May 13th, ABC News, just 2 days before Thomas killed her entire family. DCF spokeswoman Carrie Hepner released a statement acknowledging the tragedy while maintaining the careful distance required of state agencies facing potential liability. This is a horrendous tragedy. While these files offer a glimpse inside the family's home, they do not appear to contain the answer as to why this happened that we all seek at this time. First Coast News, she said. But the documents told a story of generational trauma, of interventions that didn't intervene enough, of a system that reunified a family despite its own objections, of warning signs that accumulated without triggering adequate response. The system had touched this family multiple times. In 2000, in April 2012, just days before the murders, and each time, the system had stepped back, leaving the family to its dysfunction. First Baptist Church of Port St. John held a community prayer vigil. Neighbors gathered to mourn, to process, to ask the unanswerable questions. How do you make sense of 4 young lives ended by the person who gave them life? How do you reconcile the mother who called her children's names with the mother who shot them? The case of Tonya Thomas represents a particular kind of family annihilation, one where domestic violence, substance abuse, mental health crises, and systemic failures converged into a perfect storm of tragedy. Thomas was simultaneously perpetrator and victim, a woman who had endured abuse and who became an abuser, who had suffered trauma and who inflicted the ultimate trauma on her own children. Joel, Yazlin, Jaxes, and Pebbles Johnson died not because of anything they did, but because they were born into a family where violence had deep roots, where help came too little and too late, where the adults meant to protect them, both within the family and within the systems designed to intervene, failed catastrophically. In the end, the address on Bright Avenue became a place of darkness, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous place for a child is home, and sometimes the most dangerous person is the one who should love them most. For teenagers knocked on a neighbor's door seeking safety, and when their mother called, they went back. That moment of obedience, that fundamental trust in a parent's voice, cost them everything. It is an image Port St. John will never forget, and a question that will never be satisfactorily answered. How does a mother call her wounded children home to die? Case 5. Jessica McCarty, Palm Bay, 2015. Strangulation and drowning murder of 3 children. The 911 call came just after 6 o'clock on the evening of March 20th, 2015. 33-year-old Jessica McCarty called from her home on the 1100 block of Cannimore Street Northwest in Palm Bay, saying children at the home were injured or killed. The dispatcher tried to keep her on the line, tried to understand what had happened, tried to gather information that might help the children if there was still time to save them. But there was no time left. McCarty's voice on that call would later be described as chilling in its calmness. "It's too late. It's already done," she told the dispatcher. When pressed for details, McCarty refused to elaborate. "I don't want to talk about it anymore. I want to call my mom and tell her I love her and say goodbye." Then the call ended. Palm Bay police officers raced to the scene. When officers arrived, they encountered McCarty standing in the front yard with a butcher knife. She was covered in blood, not her own, but her children's. She was not aggressive towards the officers, but she was not compliant either, said Palm Bay Police spokeswoman Yvonne Martinez. Officers used less lethal force, shooting McCarty with beanbag rounds until she finally dropped the weapon and allowed herself to be taken into custody. Inside the home on Cannimore Street, police discovered a scene of methodical horror. 7-year-old Lacey McCarty had been strangled and drowned in a bathtub. 6-year-old Philip McCarty, known to everyone as Smash, had been strangled. 5-month-old Christopher Swist lay with a cord wrapped around his tiny neck. The baby's father, Christopher Swist, had arrived at the scene before police and immediately began CPR, trying desperately to breathe life back into the child. All 3 children were rushed to area hospitals. Lacey and Philip were pronounced deceased that same evening. Baby Christopher clung to life for a few more days on life support before succumbing to his injuries. The deaths marked the worst homicides to take place in Brevard County since 1987. The investigation revealed a woman in profound crisis. Court and police records showed McCarty had a history of legal trouble, painkiller addiction, and mental health issues, and had attempted self-harm twice before. McCarty had sought mental help just days before she took her children's lives. She had reached out to mental health agencies, trying to get help, but the assistance she received proved insufficient to prevent the catastrophe that was coming. Friends and family members who spoke to investigators described Jessica as a devoted mother who loved her children deeply, but who had been struggling with depression, prescription medication dependency, and feelings of hopelessness. In the weeks before the tragic events, Jessica's behavior had become increasingly erratic. She had made comments suggesting she felt overwhelmed and trapped, that she saw no way out of her circumstances, and that she worried about what would happen to her children if she was no longer able to care for them. The children's father, Christopher Swist, was not married to Jessica, but had maintained involvement in baby Christopher's life. He described arriving at the scene to find emergency vehicles everywhere and immediately knowing something terrible had happened. His desperate attempts to revive his infant son, pumping the tiny chest and breathing into small lungs that would never draw breath on their own again, haunted him in the aftermath. He had entrusted his child to Jessica's care, never imagining that she would harm the baby or her other children. Lacey and Philip's father, who was separated from Jessica, told investigators that he had concerns about Jessica's mental state, but had not anticipated violence. The children had regular visitation with their father, and appeared to be well cared for physically, showing no signs of abuse or neglect that would have triggered intervention. Jessica had maintained the outward appearance of coping, keeping the house relatively clean, ensuring the children attended school, and fulfilling basic parental obligations even as her internal state deteriorated. The methodical nature of the crimes suggested planning rather than spontaneous violence. Jessica had strangled Lacey, then drowned her in the bathtub, using two methods to ensure the child would not survive. She had strangled 6-year-old Philip with enough force to end his life. She had wrapped a cord around baby Christopher's neck, cutting off his air supply and causing the brain damage that would ultimately prove fatal despite days of life support. These were not impulsive acts, but deliberate executions carried out by a mother who had decided her children would be better off deceased. Neighbors on Cannimore Street described hearing nothing unusual that evening before police arrived. The violence had occurred inside the home, behind closed doors, with no screams loud enough to alert others to the horror unfolding. This silence was particularly haunting. 3 children had died, and the outside world had no idea until Jessica herself called 911 to report what she had done. The Palm Bay community responded with shock and grief. Vigils were held for Lacey, Philip, and baby Christopher. Teachers from the children's schools attended, sharing memories of Lacey's love of reading and Philip's infectious energy on the playground. Neighbors brought flowers, teddy bears, and candles to a memorial that grew outside the home on Cannimore Street. The question everyone asked was the same. How could a mother do this to her own children? Jessica McCarty was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. She was held without bond at the Brevard County Jail, placed on suicide watch due to her history of self-harm attempts and statements suggesting she had intended to take her own life after ending her children's lives. Mental health evaluations were ordered to determine her competency to stand trial and her mental state at the time of the crimes. Forensic psychiatrists who evaluated Jessica diagnosed her with major depressive disorder, substance use disorder related to prescription painkillers, and possible personality disorders that affected her ability to cope with stress. However, as in many similar cases, the question was not whether Jessica was mentally ill. That was clear, but whether her illness prevented her from understanding the nature of her actions or distinguishing right from wrong. The prosecution argued that Jessica's actions demonstrated awareness and planning. She had used different methods to ensure each child died. She had called 911 afterward, indicating she understood what she had done and that it was a crime requiring police response. Her statement that "it's too late, it's already done" suggested consciousness of having committed irreversible acts. Her request to call her mother and say goodbye indicated awareness of consequences and an understanding that her life, as she knew it, was over. The defense presented evidence of Jessica's desperate attempts to get mental health help in the days before the tragedy. She had contacted crisis hotlines, visited mental health clinics, and told providers she was having dark thoughts. However, she had not been hospitalized involuntarily, had not been placed under emergency mental health detention, and had not disclosed specific plans to harm her children. The mental health system, overwhelmed and underfunded, had provided what resources it could, but had not prevented the ultimate catastrophe. In October of 2016, rather than proceed to trial, Jessica McCarty accepted a plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder in exchange for 3 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, avoiding the possibility of a death penalty trial. At the plea hearing, Jessica wept as prosecutors described her children's final moments and the desperate attempts to save baby Christopher's life. Circuit Judge George Maxwell accepted the plea and imposed the agreed-upon sentence: life without parole, 3 consecutive terms ensuring Jessica would never be released from prison. In his remarks, Judge Maxwell noted that while the court acknowledged Jessica's mental health struggles, nothing could justify or excuse the deliberate taking of 3 innocent lives. He emphasized that Lacey, Philip, and Christopher deserved to grow up, to experience life, to fulfill their potential. The families of the victims delivered impact statements that devastated everyone in the courtroom. Christopher Swiss spoke of his infant son's short life, of never getting to see the baby grow up, of the overwhelming guilt he felt for not somehow preventing the tragedy. The fathers of Lacey and Philip described their children's personalities, their dreams, their futures that would never materialize. Extended family members spoke of holidays without the children, of empty seats at family gatherings, of grief that would never fully heal. Jessica McCarty is currently incarcerated in the Florida Department of Corrections, where she will remain for the rest of her natural life. The home on Cannimore Street where 3 children died has since been occupied by new residents who likely have no knowledge of the tragedy that occurred there. The memorial that once stood outside has been cleared away, the flowers and teddy bears long since removed. But the memory of Lacey, Philip, and Christopher persists in the hearts of those who love them. 7-year-old Lacey, who loved books and dreamed of becoming a teacher. 6-year-old Philip, whose energy and joy earned him the nickname Smash. 5-month-old Christopher, who barely began his life before it was stolen from him. These 3 children deserved a mother who would protect them, nurture them, and help them grow. Instead, they got a mother who, in a moment of profound mental illness and desperation, decided they would be better off deceased. The McCarty case serves as a tragic reminder of the intersection between maternal mental illness, inadequate mental health resources, and child vulnerability. Jessica had sought help, had tried to get treatment, had expressed that she was in crisis. But the help she received was insufficient to prevent her from harming her children. The case raises difficult questions about how society can better identify and intervene when parents are in mental health crisis, how to protect children when their primary caregiver is the threat, and how to ensure that cries for help are met with effective intervention rather than minimal assistance that proves too little, too late. Today, mental health advocates use the McCarty case to highlight gaps in crisis intervention services, the need for immediate involuntary commitment when parents express thoughts of harming children, and the importance of coordinated communication between mental health providers and child protective services. But these systemic improvements came too late for Lacey, Philip, and Christopher McCarty Swist, 3 children who paid the ultimate price for a broken system's failure to protect them from their own mother. Case 6. Charisse Stinson, Largo, 2018. On the evening of September 1, 2018, a frantic call came into the Largo Police Department. A young mother named Charisse Stinson, 21 years old, reported that her 2-year-old son Jordan Beliveau had been kidnapped. She told officers a harrowing story. She had accepted a ride from a stranger driving a white Toyota Camry, a man who called himself Antoine. According to Stinson, this man had punched her in the face, rendering her unconscious. When she awoke hours later in a wooded area of Largo Central Park, her little boy was gone. The response was immediate and massive. An Amber Alert blared across cell phones throughout Florida. Law enforcement agencies mobilized. Police released a sketch of the alleged kidnapper based on Stinson's description. The community of Largo rallied, with family members and volunteers searching parks, checking behind buses, scanning every conceivable hiding spot where a small child might be found. For 3 agonizing days, the Tampa Bay area held its collective breath, hoping for Jordan's safe return. But on September 4th, the search ended in tragedy. Jordan Belivau's tiny body was discovered in a wooded area behind the Largo Sports Complex, partially covered with brush and lying in shallow water. The little boy, whom his foster parents had nicknamed Mr. Chuckles for his boisterous, joyful nature, was dead. Within hours, Stinson's story began to unravel. Largo police determined that the man named Antoine never existed. Lieutenant Randall Cheney told reporters that the injuries Stinson displayed were self-inflicted and that she had not been unconscious in the park as she claimed. During interrogation, Stinson admitted the terrible truth. There had been no kidnapping, no stranger, no Antoine. She had killed her own son. According to her confession, Jordan had been suffering from an unexplained serious injury to his leg. In a moment of frustration, she struck him in the face with the back of her hand. The force caused his head to hit a wall inside their home. Throughout the following night, Jordan experienced seizures as his condition deteriorated. Instead of seeking medical help, Stinson carried her dying child to the wooded area where his body would later be found. The autopsy revealed the full horror. Jordan died from blunt force trauma. He had a skull fracture, brain hemorrhage, bleeding beneath his scalp, a healing cut on his chin, deep cuts, and a broken leg. But Jordan Belivau's death was not simply a story of maternal violence. It was a damning indictment of a fractured child welfare system that had failed him at nearly every turn. Jordan's contact with Florida's Department of Children and Families began when he was just 3 months old. In October 2016, a call came into the child abuse hotline reporting concerns about the home where Jordan lived with his parents and paternal grandmother. The caller described a dangerous environment: drugs, gang activity, and firearms. Jordan's father was a known gang member who had been shot in his own driveway. The allegations were verified, and Jordan was removed from his parents' custody on November 1, 2016. At just 6 months old, Jordan was placed with foster parents Sam and Juliet Warren, who would care for him for the next 17 months. In their home, Jordan learned to roll over, crawl, walk, and talk. He thrived. The Warrens loved him deeply and wanted to adopt him. "He was our Mr. Chuckles," Sam Warren would later say through tears at a press conference, describing a child filled with joy, with an easy smile and a twinkle in his eye. Throughout Jordan's time in foster care, his biological parents were offered case plans with tasks including finding stable housing, receiving mental health services, and completing counseling. But both Charisse Stinson and Jordan Beliveau Sr. were consistently either non-compliant or only partially compliant. Reports of domestic violence continued. During one unsupervised Father's Day visit in 2017, Jordan's father got into a fight at a Burger King. Stinson, carrying 10-month-old Jordan in her arms, intervened, and the other woman tried to hit her but instead punched the child in the lip, Inside Edition. Stinson reportedly showed no remorse for putting her son in danger. Despite these red flags, the system's goal of family reunification moved forward. In April 2018, a magistrate recommended Jordan be returned to his mother. Jordan's guardian ad litem objected to the reunification, but crucially, no one at the hearing knew that Stinson had been expelled from her court-mandated counseling program for non-attendance. Without documentation of this failure, the objection was overruled. On May 31, 2018, after spending most of his short life in foster care, Jordan was returned to Charisse Stinson. The foster parents who had raised him felt uncomfortable voicing their concerns in court in front of Jordan's biological parents. All parties involved had 20 days to object to the reunification, but no one filed an objection. The decision to return Jordan was driven primarily by the parents' perceived compliance to case plan tasks, rather than actual changes in behavior or lifestyle. 3 months later, Jordan was dead. A subsequent investigation by the Florida Department of Children and Families revealed systemic failures at every level. DCF Secretary Chad Popple stated that despite multiple opportunities, no one changed Jordan's circumstances. Policies were not followed, communication was poor, and clear warning signs were missed. The report highlighted a fractured system of care in Pinellas County, with responsibilities divided among the Sheriff's Department, a private agency called Directions for Living, Eckerd Connects, and the State Attorney's Office. A caseworker from Directions for Living had visited Stinson's home the day before Jordan went missing. On October 13, 2020, after delays caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, Charisse Stinson pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and making a false report to law enforcement. She was sentenced to 50 years in prison. During the hearing, she told the judge she had become a better person in jail. She had given birth to another child while awaiting trial. Jordan Belivau's death sparked outrage and led to legislative change. State Representative Chris Latvala drafted what became known as Jordan's Law, requiring more training for caseworkers to recognize signs of head trauma and improving communication between child welfare and law enforcement agencies. Governor Ron DeSantis signed the bill into law in June 2020. Sam Warren, Jordan's foster father, expressed hope that their painful loss would result in a fundamental re-examination of how foster care works and the reunification process. "Jordan deserves that," he said, "and the other children in the system need that." Jordan Beliveau lived only 2 years and 4 months. Most of that time in the loving care of people who were not related to him by blood, but who cherished him nonetheless. He was returned to a mother who could not protect him, in a system too fractured to save him, and he paid with his life. Case 7. Michelle Cannimore, Jacksonville, 2018. In the early morning hours of October 18, 2018, at approximately 4:30 a.m., Jacksonville Sheriff's Office deputies responded to a frantic 911 call at the Oak Tree Apartments on Jacksonville's west side. A 5-year-old girl named Zachariah Robinson had been found unresponsive. Her mother, Michelle Cannimore, 26 years old, told first responders a harrowing story. She had heard a thud in the bathroom and discovered her daughter face down in the bathtub, submerged in water. Jacksonville Fire and Rescue rushed Zachariah to the hospital with life-threatening injuries. What medical personnel discovered upon examination would shock even the most seasoned child abuse investigators. The little girl's body told a story of systematic, prolonged torture. Medical examiners from the Child Protection Team documented severe head trauma, multiple injuries in various stages of healing, black eyes, extensive bruising throughout her body, and 4 adult human bite marks. The pattern of injuries painted an unmistakable picture. This was not an accident. This was long-term abuse. Zachariah Robinson died after being taken off life support on October 19, 2018. She was only 5 years old. The only witness to what happened in that apartment was Zachariah's 6-year-old sister. The bathtub story quickly crumbled under police questioning. Cannimore initially told police she found her daughter face down in the tub, but later admitted the scenario was a lie. When investigators interviewed Cannimore and her boyfriend, Johnny Dominique Harris, 26, the truth emerged in horrifying detail. According to statements given to police, Harris had been abusing Zachariah since August 2018. On the night of October 17, Harris became enraged because he felt the 5-year-old was being disrespectful. He struck her repeatedly in the face and head until she lost consciousness. Harris and Cannimore placed her, still unresponsive but breathing, on the couch while Cannimore went to work from 11 p.m. to 12:30 a.m. When Cannimore returned home in the early morning hours, Zachariah remained unconscious. They waited another 4 hours before finally calling 911, precious time that might have saved her life. The investigation revealed the depth of the horror Zachariah endured. When police obtained and analyzed Harris and Cannimore's phones, they uncovered a digital record of abuse. Text messages between the couple discussed Harris's abuse of the child. In some messages, Harris refers to Zachariah as the devil and tells Cannimore to keep Zachariah in an empty room and not feed her. Harris's phone search history told its own chilling story. He made several searches about her injuries such as blood in toddler's urine, broken collarbone, and body shakes pupil dilation. These searches indicated that Harris was aware of the serious injuries he was inflicting but chose to continue the abuse rather than seek help. During interrogations, Cannimore attempted to explain away the visible injuries. She claimed the bite marks and bruises were self-inflicted, an absurd assertion that investigators immediately dismissed. The forensic evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Both Michelle Cannimore and Johnny Harris were initially charged with aggravated child abuse. On October 29, 2018, 11 days after Zachariah's death, prosecutors upgraded the charges to first-degree murder. They were held without bond. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Zachariah Robinson's death was not just what happened inside that apartment, but what didn't happen outside of it. There were people who knew something was wrong. There were people who tried to intervene, and the system failed to act. 5 months before Zachariah's death, a State Department of Children and Families investigator described the girl as very healthy and talkative, Inside Edition, during a welfare check in May 2018. The investigator found no pattern of maltreatment. This was despite the fact that Zachariah's paternal grandparents, Henry and Almarie Doyle, had been sounding the alarm. According to child abuse advocate Kathy Swafford, who became involved with the family after Zachariah's death, the grandparents had contacted DCF multiple times to request welfare checks on the children. They had been trying to gain custody of both Zachariah and her 6-year-old sister. They knew abuse was occurring in that home. It was obviously beatings, Swafford told reporters. They contacted DCF to try to get welfare checks on the kids. This could have been prevented. No child should ever die the way she did. The autopsy revealed what the May investigation had missed. Multiple injuries in different stages of healing, clear evidence that the abuse had been ongoing for months. Zachariah was the 38th child death in Duval County investigated by DCF in 2018 alone. According to DCF records, the agency had prior contact with Zachariah's father after concerns were raised, but investigators found no maltreatment of the children. No incident reports were released regarding contact with Cannimore or Harris. The grandparents announced plans to sue the Department of Children and Families, asserting that the agency knew there was a history of abuse and failed to act. DCF Secretary Rebecca Capusta released a statement expressing horror and disgust at the abuse, but for Schenecker, statements came too late. She was already gone. The legal proceedings moved slowly through the courts. On November 29, 2019, Michelle Cannimore entered a guilty plea to aggravated manslaughter of a child. The first-degree murder and aggravated child abuse charges were dropped on the condition that she testify against Johnny Harris. The state recommended a sentence of 25 years, though she ultimately received 30. Harris maintained his innocence and went to trial. His defense attorneys argued that Cannimore was the one who killed Schenecker and that there was no direct evidence linking Harris to the fatal injuries. They claimed his Google searches about her injuries were made out of concern for the child, not to hide evidence of abuse. They insisted he gave a false confession to protect Cannimore. Harris's mother and sister attended the trial and expressed belief in his innocence, with his sister describing him as an A honor roll student who had never been in trouble. The trial, delayed by the COVID-19 pandemic, finally began in February 2024. The testimony was so emotionally devastating that witnesses repeatedly had to pause to collect themselves. The doctor who treated Schenecker and took her off life support broke down on the stand. A Jacksonville sheriff's officer who responded to the scene had to take a moment during testimony. Judge Mark Borrello ordered a brief recess when Cannimore broke down, crying while testifying. Several members of the all-female jury, save for one man, dabbed at their eyes throughout the proceedings. On February 8, 2024, after hearing the overwhelming evidence, the jury found Johnny Harris guilty of first-degree murder, aggravated manslaughter of a child, and aggravated child abuse. On March 15, 2024, Judge Borrello sentenced Harris to mandatory life in prison without the possibility of parole. Michelle Cannimore received 30 years. Before sentencing, a representative for Schecker's grandparents read a victim impact statement. "Thank you to all for the well wishes and prayers that we have received over the years. It's been very difficult at times, but we find our way to get through it by the grace of God. To lose a child is one of the hardest things my wife and I ever had to deal with, but we find a way to manage." In the aftermath of her death, even amidst such darkness, there was a small measure of grace. Schecker's organs were donated and used to save at least 5 lives. The Jacksonville community held a vigil to remember the little girl whose life was stolen from her. Schecker's 6-year-old sister, the only witness to the abuse, was placed in foster care where advocates worked to ensure she received care and support. Schenecker Robinson's death stands as another indictment of a child welfare system that operates with insufficient resources, inadequate training, and poor interagency communication. Despite grandparents who fought for intervention, despite visible signs that should have triggered deeper investigation, despite a system theoretically designed to protect the most vulnerable, a 5-year-old girl was tortured to death in her own home. The questions remain unanswered. How could investigators describe a child as very healthy when she was being systematically abused? Why weren't the grandparents' concerns taken more seriously? What training, protocols, or resources might have saved Scheneck's life? Michelle Cannimore, who should have been her daughter's protector, became complicit in her death. Johnny Harris, who should never have had access to a vulnerable child, inflicted unspeakable cruelty. And a system that should have saved Schenecker Robinson looked the other way until it was far too late. Case 8. Patricia Ripley, Kindle, 2020. On the evening of May 21, 2020, an Amber Alert blared across cell phones throughout South Florida. A 9-year-old boy named Alejandro Ripley had been kidnapped. His mother, Patricia Ripley, 47 years old, told police a harrowing story. She had been driving with her son near Southwest 88th Street and 158th Avenue around 8:30 p.m. when 2 black men tried to run her off the road. They demanded drugs, took her cell phone, and grabbed her son from the vehicle. The story sparked a frantic statewide manhunt. The next morning, on May 22, 2020, a body was discovered floating in a canal at the Miccosukee Golf and Country Club in Kendall Lakes. The small figure wore a Captain America t-shirt. It was Alejandro Ripley. He was dead. Within hours, Patricia Ripley's kidnapping story unraveled. Under police questioning, she recanted her entire account. She admitted she drove to the location at approximately 8:30 p.m. and led her son to the water where he drowned. When confronted by investigators, she reportedly said of Alejandro, "He's going to be in a better place." But the truth was even more horrifying than a single moment of violence. What surveillance footage revealed was a mother's determination to kill her own child, thwarted once by the heroism of strangers, who succeeded on her second attempt. Video showed Patricia Ripley walking with Alejandro on the bank of a canal behind the Kendall Acres condominiums at 103rd Avenue and Kendall Drive around 7:30 p.m. She was stroking his hair and looking around. In a single move, she shoved him into the water. Witness Elier Pozo was nearby when the incident occurred. "We were over here and we overheard some screaming," he recalled. "We were looking over to the canal and we saw the boy's head popping in and out of the water." Before Pozo could reach the child, another neighbor had already jumped in to help. "They pulled him out by the arms," Pozo said. "It was like 2 meters, and they got him out of the canal, and it looked like everything was fine." Ripley returned with bystanders who pulled Alejandro from the water and dried him off. Neighbors say Ripley and her son then left. The witnesses who saved Alejandro had no idea they were rescuing a child from his own mother. They assumed it was a tragic accident. They sent the boy home with the very person who had just tried to kill him. An hour later, she drove Alejandro to a different body of water where he drowned. This time, unfortunately, there was no one there to save him. His small body was found the next morning at the Miccosukee Golf and Country Club, floating in the water. Alejandro Ripley was a 9-year-old boy with severe autism who was nonverbal. He attended a school for special needs children. The only voice in his life that he depended on to get through this world was his mom's, and to think that that voice would be the one to harm him the most, said Miami-Dade Deputy Director Freddie Ramirez at a press conference following her arrest. On May 23, 2020, at approximately 3 a.m., Patricia Ripley was booked into the Miami-Dade jail. She faced charges including murder in the first degree, kidnapping, child abuse with great bodily harm, attempted murder, and several others. She was held without bond. The fabricated kidnapping story had a particularly disturbing element. Patricia Ripley described the alleged abductors as 2 black men, though she described herself as a white Hispanic. Deputy Director Ramirez addressed this at the press conference. "As a parent, as a member of this community, I am deeply saddened about what happened to that young boy, and then for her to displace blame of her crime on another community is just as well as another crime that was committed." According to law enforcement sources, Ripley took full responsibility and told police the older Alejandro got, the harder he was to physically control. This appeared to be the motive. A mother overwhelmed by the challenges of caring for a severely autistic child who chose murder over seeking help. Patricia Ripley appeared in court via closed-circuit television for a brief bond hearing. She did not speak during the proceedings. Her attorney, Nelson Rodriguez Varela, told reporters, "We will have another time to discuss what the evidence is in the case, and certainly, she will have her day in court. At this time, we're assembling a legal team in order to make sure that her rights are respected and she has the opportunity to vindicate her good name." Alejandro's father, Aldo Ripley, spoke to reporters outside their home, clearly in shock. "The only thing I'll say is that we love our life. We love Alejandro, and we don't agree with whatever they say about my wife. It's not real." Rodriguez Varela added, "By all accounts, she has been an excellent mother, an excellent person." But the video surveillance footage told a different story. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. In October 2020, a Miami-Dade grand jury indicted Patricia Ripley on first-degree murder charges. Under Florida law, only someone indicted by a grand jury can receive the death penalty. Prosecutors announced they would pursue the death penalty. State Attorney Catherine Fernandez Rundle stated, "The death of a child is tragic. The killing of a child is horrific." The community responded with grief and horror. A vigil was held to remember Alejandro, with neighbors and strangers gathering to mourn a child they had never met, but whose death touched them deeply. Sofia Cabrera, a neighbor of the Ripleys, said simply, "He didn't deserve anything that happened to him." In the aftermath of Alejandro's death, the University of Miami NSU Center for Autism and Related Disabilities issued a statement urging families with special needs children to reach out for help. Executive Director Michael Alessandri said, We remain steadfast in our mission to support individuals with autism and related disabilities and their families at every age and stage of life. We will work with our community partners and stakeholders to redouble our efforts to serve our families, expand resources, and build an even stronger community of care. The legal proceedings dragged on for years, complicated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Ripley's defense lawyer stated that jail visits were suspended due to virus risk, limiting their discussions to virtual meetings. Trial dates were set and postponed multiple times. In early 2024, Ripley successfully petitioned for a new judge, and the case was reassigned to Associate Administrative Judge Marissa Tinkler-Mendez. During a brief arraignment via video conference, Ripley's attorney, Susie Ribeiro-Ayala, declared her client's plea of not guilty and requested discovery, Inside Edition. Despite her confession to police and overwhelming video evidence, Ripley maintained her innocence through her legal team. By April 2024, prosecutors had put the death penalty back on the table while simultaneously expressing willingness to negotiate a plea deal. No details of any potential offer were made public. A trial date was tentatively set for August 26, 2024, though proceedings were projected to potentially extend into 2025. As of the latest court records, Patricia Ripley remains incarcerated at the Miami-Dade Turner Guilford Night Correctional Center without bond, awaiting trial. The case continues to wind through the legal system, delayed by pandemic restrictions, attorney changes, and the complex nature of a capital murder prosecution. The questions surrounding Alejandro Ripley's death extend beyond the legal proceedings. What resources were available to Patricia Ripley as the parent of a severely autistic child? Did she seek help from the numerous organizations dedicated to supporting families with special needs children? Or did she suffer in silence until desperation turned to violence? The tragedy of Alejandro Ripley is compounded by the fact that he was saved once. Good Samaritans heard his screams, jumped into the water, and pulled him to safety. They dried him off and sent him home, believing they had witnessed and prevented an accident. They could not have known that within an hour, the same hands that stroked his hair would push him into another canal, this time with no one around to hear his cries. Alejandro Ripley lived 9 years. He was nonverbal but not voiceless. His screams in that first canal brought people running to save him. He wore a Captain America t-shirt, perhaps a symbol of the heroes he loved, unaware that he would need a hero most when there was no one left to save him. He depended on his mother's voice to navigate a world he could not fully communicate with, and that voice led him to his death. In a community already reeling from the pandemic, from social isolation, and from economic uncertainty, the death of Alejandro Ripley served as a painful reminder of the fragility of the most vulnerable among us. Patricia Ripley now faces the possibility of capital punishment for a crime captured on video, witnessed by neighbors, and ultimately confessed. But no sentence will bring back the 9-year-old boy in the Captain America t-shirt whose only crime was being born different in a world that did not protect him from the person who should have loved him most. Case 9. Ebony Wilkerson, Daytona Beach, 2014. The morning of March 4, 2014, began with a desperate plea for help. In Daytona Beach, Florida, a woman named Jessica Harold dialed 911, her voice laced with concern and fear. Her sister, Ebony Wilkerson, was not herself. "She's talking about Jesus, that there's demons in the house," Harold told the dispatcher. "She's got the kids in the car with her." The 32-year-old mother from South Carolina had arrived in Florida seeking refuge from what family members described as an abusive marriage. But instead of finding safety, Ebony Wilkerson was spiraling into a psychiatric crisis that would culminate in one of the most harrowing beach rescues captured on video, and a case that would spark national debate about mental health, domestic violence, and the limitations of emergency intervention laws. After receiving Harold's 911 call, Daytona Beach police officers stopped Wilkerson's black Honda Odyssey. Behind the wheel sat a pregnant woman, 27.5 weeks along, with 3 young children buckled in the back seat, a 3-year-old, a 9-year-old, and a 10-year-old. Police Chief Mike Chitwood later recalled that when officers spoke with Wilkerson, she expressed fear that her husband, Lutful Ron John, was coming to Florida to harm her and the children. "When we spoke with her, she was lucid," Chitwood explained. "The children were in the back seat, they were buckled in, and were not in distress. Although the sergeant said she looked like she had some mental illness, she did not fit the criteria for going into custody under the Baker Act. The Florida Mental Health Act, commonly known as the Baker Act, allows authorities to involuntarily take people into custody if they appear to be a threat to themselves or others. Despite the officer's concerns about Wilkerson's mental state, she did not make statements indicating she was suicidal or homicidal. The children appeared safe. The officers had no legal grounds to detain her. They let her go. It was a decision that would haunt everyone involved. 2 hours later, at approximately 3 p.m., beachgoers on Daytona Beach witnessed something nightmarish. A black minivan was driving toward the ocean, not stopping at the water's edge, but continuing straight into the rolling Atlantic surf. The windows were rolled up. The doors were locked. And inside, 3 children were screaming. Her son came out the window, probably about waist high, screaming for help, recalled Stacy Robinson, a 21-year-old who happened to be nearby. He immediately jumped from his vehicle and ran toward the minivan, walking alongside it as it continued into deeper water. The son was snatching at the wheel, trying to get her to come back toward the shore, Robinson said. I was like, you've got to get out of the water. You're going to get in trouble. You got kids. You're scaring them. They're crying. She was like, okay, as though she was coming back out the water, and took off. Beach cameras captured the horrifying scene. The van bobbed violently in the rough surf as waves crashed against it. Bystanders and beach safety officers rushed into the cold water. Tim Tessinier, another rescuer, reached the vehicle and tried desperately to communicate with Wilkerson. There's a baby, he shouted, but the mother wouldn't respond. She wouldn't say a word. She didn't tell us nothing about a baby, Tessinier later recalled. She had this look on her face. I can't describe it. It was just an awful blank look, like spaced out look. As rescuers frantically worked to break into the vehicle, Wilkerson crawled out through a window and walked away from the van, leaving her children still trapped inside as the ocean threatened to swallow the vehicle whole. The men pulled the children to safety one by one through the hatchback and driver's side door. The waves were strong and the water was cold, said Mark Swanson, Volusia County Beach Safety Director. If it had been minutes longer, the outcome probably would have been different. Miraculously, all 3 children survived without serious physical injuries. But the psychological trauma of that day would follow them forever. One child later told officers that their mother had told them to close their eyes and go to sleep as she drove into the ocean. The child said their mother kept insisting she was taking them to a better place and repeating, I am keeping all of us safe. Wilkerson was transported to Halifax Health Medical Center for evaluation, where she gave birth while in custody. When authorities questioned her, the charging affidavit noted that she seemed confused and jumped from one religious topic to another. At first, she claimed she had been driving too close to the water when the waves pulled her in. Later, she admitted she didn't want her husband around the children. The first words she spoke to a beach safety officer after the rescue were about her husband. She alleged he had abused her. On March 7, 2014, Volusia County Sheriff Ben Johnson announced that Ebony Wilkerson was being charged with 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder and 3 counts of aggravated child abuse. The charging affidavit stated bluntly, Ebony Wilkerson acted with premeditated design to kill her 3 children. Her bond was set at $1.2 million. But the story was far more complex than a simple criminal case. While in jail, Wilkerson's mental health deteriorated dramatically. Her public defender reported that she had punched herself in the stomach repeatedly while pregnant, so violently that she required hospitalization. What happens when you put someone with a mental condition with no clothes, no blanket, 72 degrees, in a concrete cell with a small window, and 2 people looking at you? Asked Assistant Public Defender Craig Dyer. Family members came forward with troubling allegations about Wilkerson's husband. Her sister filed an injunction against Lutful Ron John, claiming he had threatened to kill her and Ebony if she tried to help Ebony escape his abuse. Records revealed that Wilkerson had filed a sexual assault complaint against her husband just days before the incident. Ron John, through his attorney, denied the allegations, calling them the result of extreme mental illness. By December 2014, the attempted murder charges against Wilkerson were dropped. At a court hearing before Circuit Judge Leah Case, a state psychiatrist testified that Wilkerson suffered from schizoaffective disorder, a serious mental illness combining symptoms of schizophrenia and mood disorders. When asked about her state of mind on March 4th, Wilkerson testified that she believed God was with her and that her children needed a cleansing. "I just kept going, kept following the Holy Spirit," she said. "I was following the Holy Spirit wherever it went." Judge Case found Ebony Wilkerson not guilty by reason of insanity on 3 counts of felony child abuse. She was committed to a state psychiatric hospital for treatment. The road to recovery would be long and marked by setbacks. In 2016, after being released to a transitional facility, Wilkerson stopped taking her medication and experienced another psychotic episode, requiring her return to state custody. But with proper treatment, medication, and supervision, she gradually stabilized. By 2017, Wilkerson was living in a residential treatment center in Daytona Beach, participating in a court-ordered program to manage her bipolar disorder. In 2018, she spoke with local media about her journey. "I've been through a lot," she said. "I have been a better person. For me to be able to step up and say, I have a mental illness issue, and I'm not afraid of that." She saw her children every other weekend and was working toward full reunification with her family. In September 2019, Circuit Judge Raul Zambrano allowed Wilkerson to return home to South Carolina under strict conditions. She had to continue mental health counseling, receive injectable psychotropic medications, and remain supervised whenever alone with her children. The family participated in therapy together. By December 2021, Wilkerson's progress was undeniable. Court-appointed psychologist Dr. William Meadows testified that she had been compliant with treatment for over 4 years with no relapses. Judge Zambrano agreed to ease most supervision requirements, though he ordered healthcare providers to randomly check with Wilkerson's doctors to ensure she continued taking her long-lasting Abilify injections. "I don't want to minimize your efforts," Zambrano told Wilkerson via Zoom. "I think everyone recognizes you have done very, very well, and that you have improved in terms of insight to your medical issues, and that you have done everything possible to correct them. I'm going to put your own mental health in your own hands." Today, Ebony Wilkerson lives with her husband and 4 children in South Carolina. The case of Ebony Wilkerson raises profound questions about mental health intervention, domestic violence, and the systems meant to protect both mothers and children. Could the tragedy have been prevented if police had greater authority under the Baker Act? How do we balance civil liberties with public safety when mental illness is involved? Her story is not simply one of a mother who endangered her children. It's a story of severe mental illness, possible domestic abuse, systemic failures, and ultimately, the possibility of recovery and redemption when proper mental health treatment is provided. The 3 children who screamed for help in the Atlantic Ocean that day survived, and so did their mother. Together, they are building a new life. One day, one medication dose, one therapy session at a time. Case 10. Nicole Marie Labor, Naples, 2023. The morning of June 17, 2023, began as an ordinary Saturday in Naples, Florida. But by 7:40 a.m., a frantic 911 call would set in motion an investigation that would expose a tragic web of neglect, deception, and the devastating consequences of a mother's fatal lapse in judgment. Nicole Marie Labor, 29 years old at the time, called the Collier County Sheriff's Office in a state of panic. Her 8-month-old daughter was unresponsive. Through tears and hysterical cries, Labor told the dispatcher a story that would later unravel. Her baby had somehow drowned in the family dog's water bowl. When deputies arrived at Labor's home on Everglades Boulevard, they found a mother in apparent distress and an infant who desperately needed help. Officers immediately began chest compressions on the tiny victim, then deployed an automated external defibrillator while waiting for paramedics to arrive with advanced life-saving equipment. Despite their efforts, the baby would be pronounced dead at Naples Community Hospital Northeast shortly after arrival. At the hospital, Labor repeated her account to investigators. She claimed she had briefly left her daughter alone in the house while she rushed outside to retrieve her dog and another young child who had escaped through the front door. When she returned, she said, she discovered her baby face down in the dog's water bowl, a vessel measuring only 10 inches wide at the top and 5 inches deep. But even as Labor told her story, investigators noticed details that didn't add up. The infant was wearing a clean, dry diaper, unusual for a child who had just drowned. On the baby's right thigh was a fresh linear mark that resembled a strap or belt buckle. These observations raised immediate red flags. When deputies returned to Labor's home to conduct a thorough investigation, the scene told a different story than the one they'd been given. The dog's water bowl sat on the kitchen counter, not on the floor where a crawling infant might access it. A towel lay near the front door, completely dry despite Labor's claim that she had just rushed in from outside. Next to the dog bowl on the counter, investigators found a blue-colored marijuana pipe with residue inside, along with a container of medical marijuana prescribed to Labor. She denied using the marijuana that morning. The most damning evidence, however, was in the bathroom. The bottom surface of the bathtub appeared wet, with fecal matter near the drain. The drain itself seemed clogged with some sort of toy. Against the wall sat a small blue booster seat, the kind designed for bathing infants, with a buckle strap that matched the mark on the baby's thigh. Labor's husband, Shane, had also begun to suspect something was wrong with his wife's account. When he saw the evidence in the bathroom, he confronted Nicole directly. Under pressure from her spouse, the truth began to emerge. 2 days after her daughter's death, on June 19, 2023, Nicole Labor contacted the Collier County Sheriff's Office. She wanted to revise her original statement. The story she told this time was vastly different and utterly heartbreaking. Labor admitted that she had placed her 8-month-old daughter in the booster seat in the bathtub, strapped her in, and filled the tub with 1 to 2 inches of water. She then left the infant completely alone while she went to use the toilet in another bathroom, citing her need for alone time. When she returned, she found her daughter floating unresponsive in the water. The booster seat had tipped over, trapping the helpless baby face down under just a few inches of water. The child had drowned. But instead of immediately calling for help, Labor made a series of calculated decisions. She removed her deceased daughter from the bathtub and took her out of the booster seat. She placed the seat back in its usual position against the bathroom wall. She dressed her dead baby in a fresh, clean diaper. She staged the entire scene to suggest an accident involving the dog's water bowl, the only water source she could think of at that time, according to the arrest affidavit. Only then did Nicole Labor place her daughter's body on the couch and dial 911. Sheriff Kevin Rambosk addressed the tragedy publicly. This is an absolute tragedy. But thanks to the dedication and skill of our detectives, we now know what actually happened to this innocent baby, and justice can be carried out. On June 23, 2023, Labor was arrested and charged with aggravated manslaughter of a child. She was held at the Collier County Jail on a $50,000 bond. The case slowly moved through Florida's legal system. Labor remained incarcerated, and on September 16, 2025, after more than 2 years behind bars, she appeared before Collier County Circuit Judge John McGowan. She entered a plea of no contest to 1 count of aggravated manslaughter of a child. Judge McGowan accepted the plea and sentenced Nicole Labor to 10 years in prison, with credit for the 669 days she had already served. Following her release, she will face an additional 10 years of probation. The case highlights a tragic reality. Drowning remains one of the leading causes of accidental death among young children, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Infants and toddlers can drown in just inches of water, and it can happen in mere moments. The American Academy of Pediatrics emphasizes that children should never be left unattended in or near water, not even for a second. Nicole Labor's need for alone time cost her daughter everything. Her subsequent attempts to conceal her culpability through staging and deception added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating situation. The baby, identified in court documents only by the initials PL, never had the chance to celebrate her first birthday, take her first steps, or say her first words. She remains unnamed in most public records, a small victim of maternal neglect whose brief life ended in a preventable tragedy. For the Naples community and for all who followed this case, it serves as a painful reminder that childcare requires constant vigilance, that momentary lapses can have permanent consequences, and that the truth, no matter how painful, must always come to light. We've journeyed through 10 verified cases of maternal violence in Florida, each representing a unique combination of circumstances, yet all sharing one horrifying commonality: mothers who failed in their most fundamental duty to protect their children's lives. From Casey Anthony's case that captivated the nation to the tragedies that unfolded across Florida, we've witnessed the full spectrum of maternal evil. We've seen mothers driven by desire for freedom, like Casey Anthony. Ideological extremism leading to starvation, as with Sheila O'Leary. Severe mental illness manifesting in violence, as with Julie Schenecker and Ebony Wilkerson. Revenge killings and custody disputes, like Tonya Thomas. Mothers viewing children as burdens, like Patricia Ripley. And mental health crises culminating in violence, as in Jessica McCarty's case. These cases challenge our assumptions about maternal instinct and force us to confront an uncomfortable reality. The bond between mother and child, while powerful, is not inviolable. Under certain circumstances, mental illness, substance abuse, overwhelming stress, romantic obsession, ideological extremism, or pure selfishness, that bond can fracture completely, leading to unthinkable violence. The vulnerability of children is laid bare in these cases. When the primary protector becomes the primary threat, children have no defenses. Most victims were too young to flee, call for help, or comprehend what was happening. Their complete dependence made them easy targets for mothers who had lost the capacity to fulfill their parental obligations. Warning signs existed in many cases but were subtle, dismissed, or unrecognized until too late. Common threads include isolation from support systems, untreated mental illness, economic stress, relationship instability, and failure to seek or receive adequate help before reaching the breaking point. These 10 cases represent only a fraction of Florida's maternal violence incidents. Each represents a child whose life was cut short by maternal betrayal, leaving behind grieving families and traumatized communities struggling to understand how such horrors could occur. As a society, we must ask, how do we better identify mothers in crisis before they harm their children? How do we ensure mental health resources are accessible and effective? How do we create communities where struggling parents feel safe asking for help? Prevention requires vigilance at every level, from family members taking concerns seriously to professionals screening for mental health issues to communities willing to intervene when children are at risk. If you or someone you know is struggling with thoughts of harming children, help is available. Contact the National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-4-A-CHILD, 1-800-424-2453. For mental health crises, contact the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 988. For postpartum issues, reach Postpartum Support International at 1-800-9444-PPD. Seeking help is not weakness, it's courage and love. Thank you for watching this Cold Case Hour documentary on Florida's most evil mothers. Understanding these cases helps us work toward preventing future tragedies. If you found this informative, please hit that like button, share your thoughts respectfully in the comments, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour for more in-depth true crime documentaries. Remember the victims: Kaylee Marie Anthony, Ezra O'Leary, Bo and Calix Schenecker, Jaxes, Joel, Jaslyn and Pebbles Johnson, Lacey and Philip McCarty and Christopher Swist, Alejandro Ripley, and all the innocent children whose lives were stolen by those who should have loved them most. These children deserved better. They deserved mothers who would protect them, nurture them, and help them grow. They deserved to experience life, chase dreams, and fulfill their potential. Instead, their lives were cut short by maternal violence that, in many cases, could have been prevented. We remember them, we honor them, and we commit to ensuring their deaths were not in vain. That through increased awareness, better resources, and vigilant communities, we can save future children who cannot save themselves. This is Cold Case Hour, reminding you that the truth, however disturbing, deserves to be told. These children mattered. Their stories matter. And by bearing witness, we ensure they are never forgotten.